Well, a very good afternoon, morning, or evening to you, and welcome to this edition of A Reason for Hope. Sean Richards hosting today, joined by, well, it'll just be me today, but we are celebrating I guess celebrating would be the wrong word for it, but it is Monday, in which we are, of course, setting time aside for apologetics topics, which we have very uncreatively dubbed Apologetics Monday. If you, of course, are interested about a specific area of not just studies within Christianity, but maybe in opposition to it, we are taking the time aside this week to, of course, go more into direct detail about that specific topic. And, of course, this week's topic will be that of witchcraft or Wicca. Wiccanism, Gardenian Wicca, any of those other terms. If someone calls themselves a witch or a spiritist, someone who has nature worship associated with their belief in gods, or redundancy there, goddesses, I guess was the word I was looking for, then this program is designed to equip you for just that. And we'll, of course, be looking forward to hopefully giving you information that will be of benefit in your personal life. This is not just meant to be to puff yourself up in knowledge, but to give you the kind of perspective that's informed when you are ministering to people that you care about. You're not just going to steamroll them with Christianity, but you're going to at least let them know that you've taken the time to understand things from their perspective, and that, of course, when you ask them questions about what they specifically believe, you know where and when things are getting off track as far as the actual facts are concerned, and when to ask more specific questions. That's the intent of these Apologetics Mondays, and we hope that they're a blessing to you. I say celebrate is the wrong word, because at the time of this broadcast and recording, it is the 1-year anniversary of October 7th, the massacre that took place in the nation of Israel, of which and by which many hostages are still in the custody of Hamas. So we ask that you would pray for not just the peace of Jerusalem, but the rescue and salvation of these individuals, because it is still a horrible situation despite over a year, or actually exactly a year, passing since these events have taken place. We also encourage you to pray for the intercontinental United States as we are preparing for yet another hurricane during hurricane season, and many victims in the greater Florida and coastal areas of the United States will be affected by that. And of course, all in general, the greater edification of the body of Christ. So without further ado, and hoping that God speaks more during this broadcast than I do, why don't we take a moment to pray and ask for exactly that. Dad, we are so blown away that you would use programs like this, that we're gathering together to not only hear your word spoken, but to be able to engage with it in people that not only have throughout history been in direct opposition to your heart, but that the kind of mercy that you show to us every day is also due to them. These are the kind of people that you ministered to during your time here on this earth, and as we have the opportunity to model your heart wherever possible, I ask that our engagements with those who are not just in bondage, but thoroughly deceived by witchcraft and all that it promises, that we'd be able to come at this from an informed perspective, a compassionate perspective, but also one that is abounding in grace and truth, as you yourself modeled when you revealed yourself to us in history. Show yourself as better than the things of this world, and allow us to be Exhibit A of that. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Or that is true, if you will. Now, witchcraft, again, tends to get a very stereotypical view as far as pop culture and media is concerned. Whether it's the general idea of controlling the universe with your incantations, someone who is of a more level-minded perspective but wears that pentagram as an admiration of nature, or someone in between. What's really, really important when it comes to the Christian to fill-in-the-blank perspective and dialogue is to first and foremost recognize that the disrespect issue cuts both ways when we make assumptions about what someone believes and then hold them accountable to what we decided they believe, as opposed to what their religion and history actually teaches and demonstrates. we oftentimes have grievances during the broadcast when people hand to us a bad version of Christianity and then have us basically answer for it when that's not what Christianity teaches, never what Jesus taught, or certainly not something that we ever did, but now suddenly are being held responsible for. When it comes down to it, we want to make sure that we are willing to treat others as we would be treated, as our Lord himself said, when these issues come up regarding differences in our general view of God. Now, I'm not saying that in order to build a bridge and saying that witchcraft is equally valid as Christianity in their approach to God. But what I am saying is that when we have not just assumptions about people, it can cloud our ability to effectively communicate with them, and we need to use ourselves first as the framework to be able to say, if I was being talked to like this and you switched the category from Wicca to Christianity, would I respect it? Obviously not. So make sure that when you are engaging with someone who identifies themselves as a witch, try not to laugh or let the, black pointy hat and curses and hexes cloud your vision as to what that actually entails, because even during the medieval and prior periods, there is very little that has changed regarding human nature and the expressions thereof, which of course witchcraft allows for a pretty consistent outlet, and we don't even recognize it. So for the next 51 minutes and 21 seconds, we're going to be discussing 3 categories of our understanding of Wicca so that we can have an informed approach of how to engage with them properly. And I also note in advance, if there is ever a pause or a muffled series of coughs during this program, I'm not being cursed by the local Wicca coven. I am still recovering from a bug I picked up upon my travels and returned from the other side of the United States, and adjusting from a very moisture-heavy climate to the United States desert is definitely a tough one. So humor me if you hear any pauses. I'll be doing my best to this, and we have a lot of prayers on the outside trying to keep me stable. So, well, on my second cough drop, the first thing that we're going to be discussing is the history of Wicca, what it's based on, where the terms come from, who the first figurehead of the term, but not the actual founder of Wicca, Gerald Gardner, was. And then lastly, what is witchcraft as opposed to Wicca, which you're going to find the former a lot more common. The second category will be the claims of Wicca and witchcraft, that these spiritist religions can vary from belief in pantheism, meaning that the universe, creation, and the creator, God, are one and the same, or polytheism, that they just regard in a passing fancy the ideas of literal entities separate from creation, but that they're involved and present all around us. The term Summerland will hopefully come up. It is the common Wicca term for the afterlife, but there are others as well that we will mention briefly. And lastly, the Wicca Read, what their moral system is ultimately built on, and the philosophy that ironically produced it. And then lastly, the category of challenging Wicca, the sort of conversations, good conversations, that you'll be getting into when engaging with witches, is ultimately going to be dealing with issues like feelings versus facts. Can truth about religion be known? The history of the Druids compared to Jesus of Nazareth, and so on and so forth. Who would you consider to be a reliable source of spiritual information? Who are you trusting in from an informed perspective? So starting with history, let's start with the dictionary. When it comes down to it, it's important to understand terms. And while the witch or witchcraft practicer, Wiccan, is going to not necessarily understand the history of and may not even express it in the exact same way, the reason why I want to discuss these terms and their meanings isn't because, like I started the broadcast with, you're to hold this to them, but you're going to understand that when they say, for example, reference Bible passages that say, "Suffer not the witch to live, those who practice sorcery must be put to death," you're able to clarify exactly what that's addressing and what historically witches and witchcraft have been under the banner of, so that there's no misunderstanding about the Salem witch trials speaking for all of Christianity, when in reality it was about a dozen people who were falsely accused of what we'll discuss in a moment. That's the whole point. The reason why these terms are being said is to say, this is what you are, but this is what we mean, so that there's no needless conflict, or maybe a clarification so that potential hazards are avoided. Starting with sorcery. Sorcery, for those of you who aren't aware, isn't, again, that, Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars, Dark Side of the Force, incantations and chanting and so forth. The word itself comes from a Greek term that would be referring to drug abusers. The word pharmakia is in its of itself not necessarily an evil term, because we also recognize that there is a good use of pharmaceuticals that we would call drugstores. And when someone goes to a drugstore, they could just as much be referring to their need for specific prescriptions, stuff that you need a doctor's advice to because it can have some gnarly side effects, or things that are generally, I wouldn't say benign, but not as hazardous and certainly helpful for commonplace issues like Motrin, aspirin, and cold symptom relievers like the cough drops that I was pounding before the broadcast. Pharmakia ultimately stems from that term, though, and when you use a term, it's naturally important to understand there is a use and an abuse of that sort of activity. So in the ancient world, when you were referring to a sorcerer, it wasn't actually describing someone who was putting forward a religious idea. It was actually synonymous with the European term for apothecary or medicine man. Now, with that then in mind, and even biblically, this is how the term is used. You can read it in Strong's Concordance 5331. It is a feminine noun if you're interested. But its ultimate definition is the use of medicine, drugs, or spells. The usage is generally in terms of magic or enchantments, but you need to recognize that these drugs are ultimately where these spells and enchantments got their reputation. Because while we can't imagine, or at least we shouldn't imagine, some demonic entity causing lightning to come down at someone's will or to transform someone from a newt back into a man because somehow they got better and so forth. Monty Python reference, don't worry about it. We need to recognize that this is actually what we would understand today as people undergoing hallucinations and drug-induced stupors, that the experiences and even stereotypes of witches and warlocks historically have been documented alongside people that would understand and recognize common modern terms as the sort of experiences we would understand as someone who would be, not to use it pejoratively, but be described as a junkie. When, say, for example, and I don't want to get too graphic with this on air, but when we're referring to witches riding on brooms and so forth, it's not because they visually experienced levitation, but because they would use broomsticks to administer some numbing agents to parts of their body that will remain unnamed. And of course, it would make their legs feel numb, if not non-existent. And so through the broomsticks, they'd be flying around. And likewise with curses or people being struck dead by the incantations of witches, when someone who is used to a heavy dose or supply of narcotics and other substance abuses, mixed in cauldrons and so forth, you understand the medicinal properties that they're using to form these sort of drugs. It's ultimately centered around the idea that from the fumes alone you can overdose. The fentanyl crisis in the United States, police officers by the fumes alone undercovering drug busts have been overdosed because it's just that potent a material. Naturally, in the ancient world, they couldn't get them that potent, but it's starting to make sense why, the witches are going to curse you with death and spells and maladies and so forth. When if you apply it to modern day vernacular and saying, careful with those drugs because they have gnarly side effects, or don't go in that guy's house, you might pick up what he's smoking and end up having to deal with the consequences of that needlessly, secondhand smoke and all that, suddenly this starts to fall in line. Understand that's the historical framework that witchcraft and sorcery are ultimately held under, the abuse of drugs, not necessarily the concept of them as a whole. And yes, there are and were superstitious groups that believed that in affiliation with these things, the sort of drug-inspired beliefs that human sacrifice, bloodletting, and other rituals would produce a greater high, but understand it's always associated with these less than savory sources of input that make you more susceptible to bad ideas and also more willing to produce them and act on them. The point being made, I think, is self-explanatory. So when we're talking about witches then, what does the term actually mean? Well, it was referring to those who would be familiar with the use and mixtures and purposes of these sort of medicines, but not under the approval of the state or local government. Illegal apothecaries, or to use the modern term, drug dealers. Not necessarily worshipers of Satan, unless you're noting in an indirect sense and rebelling against God. But even if you were to note that, modern Satanists are just atheists that would celebrate autonomy without accountability. Do what feels good, and therefore that makes it right. Philosophy that, again, predominates a lot more of our society than we'd like to admit. And when we're talking even about drug dealers, that term itself isn't just referring to, the conniving guy in the trench coat. It's like, you like to buy something. No, it's someone who would distribute drugs for financial or personal gain, obviously not considering the consequences they would have on someone else. But in the terms of the ancient world, again, not to be too crass and disrespectful, but the idea of them smoking what they're selling is what set the stereotype. Illegal apothecaries who would distribute these sort of medicines, or more appropriately, in improper doses, poisons, would be what you would consider a witch. And witches could be either male or female as far as a user, this is what the word means, of sorcery, drugs, but in an improper fashion. When we say warlocks, the term is oftentimes confused as to say, so you have like the males are warlocks and the females are witches. No, they're all witches. Warlocks have taken a variety of modern terms in, I guess, the world that we live in. But the word itself also has a different origin, and that it's referring to an oath breaker or literally a deceiver. It's an insult specifically geared towards someone's reputation, not necessarily towards their activity. So if you encounter someone who calls themselves a warlock, it would be like, well, it would almost be one-to-one comparative to when Christians today identify themselves by that title, since it was originally intended as an insult in Antioch, but the Christians embraced it because it accurately described, we are trying to be little Christs. They embraced the negative pejorative and turned it into a title of honor. But for the most part, when you encounter someone, say, for example, a male, who would call themselves a witch, they're not mixing up gendered terms. That's just using the word for someone who practices sorcery. And when the Bible, for example, Deuteronomy 18 would be the most direct note of this, and verse 9 reads, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations, the things that the Lord doesn't approve of and is even disgusted by. This is not something that's to be modeled by his people. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, Moloch worship, roasting children alive, or one who practices witchcraft. As we noted in word origin, someone who would abuse drugs or medicine. A soothsayer, con men, we've had Adrian Van Vactor talk about this before, or one who interprets omens, self-explanatory. Or a sorcerer, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. For all those who do these things are an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord your God drives them out from before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God, for the nations which you will dispossess listen to soothsayers and diviners. As for you, the Lord your God has not appointed such for you. The point that he's making, that Moses speaking on behalf of the Lord is saying, is that we shouldn't be under the influence of these kinds of people who are depending on us being dumbed down by what we're smoking, ingesting, and so on and so forth. We should instead be informed of the spiritual by an informed source, God, and those who are speaking rationally as a result of what he's revealed to us. When people use, again, narcotics, and we can have plenty of people, feel free to ask, by the way, if you'd like this in a future time, but people who are in these kind of environments, or even by the grace of God have been called out of these environments, who are all too eager to discuss the matters of the supernatural while they are ingesting these sort of chemicals and abusing drugs. And when, of course, God comes up, even former co-host Peter Martin used to be on the broadcast before, he would oftentimes talk about how his Marine buddies, when they were getting high on marijuana and so forth, and he had to be the designated driver because he didn't engage with all that stuff anymore. Well, he never did in terms of marijuana, but that's emphasizing the point. he would find that they were all too eager to talk about spirituality, and even out front said to him that I can't talk about God unless I'm high. Well, you can see the problem, first of all, with that, and that they're not going to process any of the information meaningfully, nor are they going to be able to communicate these sort of things in any practical fashion because their brains are literally being put through a blender. Now, when we are describing a society that is gullible to the point where anything that you say regarding spirituality is accepted, but none of it is actually recognized, understood, or received, you're dealing with a very biblically illiterate culture. And you don't necessarily even need to have dependency on drugs to do this. You can find people who are so burned out on caffeine that they can't function, and that, of course, is its own discussion. Now, as far as continuing with the history behind this, some of the claims that will be important in regards to Wicca, and specifically Gardenian Wicca, which we'll talk about more in a moment, is that when we're talking about the supernatural, meaning in addition to the natural or beyond the natural, it's mainly going to be the sort of people that they've respected the insights of and who have guided them through these drug-induced stupors or pleasure-based stupors or ritualistic hypnotic state stupors. Someone who's been put into, purposely or not, a reduced state of consciousness so that they're exposed more to the supernatural. We as Christians understand that that's a bad idea because at worst, you're not going to get anything meaningful, or I guess at best, you're not getting anything meaningful. At worst, you might encounter a spiritual entity, but not the kind of one you get doctrine from. This is where ultimately people have tried to draw their claims. When, of course, governing Wicca itself, the founder of Wicca, at least at its origins, was Gerald Gardner, the founder, again, from 1884 to 1964, fairly recent historical figure, wrote a document called the Book of Shadows, where if you read it online, and don't worry, you won't get possessed. You essentially just read these ramblings and manuals and guides of all of these traditions that he claimed came from the ancient Druids regarding ancient paganism, Druidism, and a manual for how they ought to understand their own spirituality and the reverence of what they would call the Mother Goddess. This is Gardenian Wicca, specifically referencing his name because with that individual in mind, they're considering him an authority. The problem is, and we'll get more into this later, the claims of the ancient Druids, or Druidism, are the practices of the ancient oak seers in Northern Europe, who historically were wiped out by Julius Caesar during the Gallic Wars. That was before the time of Christ, for those of you who are taking notes. We know next to nothing about them, and we'll emphasize that when we get more into a comparison in term. But despite us actually having nothing, Gerald Gardner gave this manual for how we are to appreciate these ancient traditions and cultures and how they approach the supernatural and how it seemed to work for them. Note that term. They would identify nature as the embodiment or a pantheistic, meaning creator and creation are one and the same, regarded altogether as the mother goddess, that the afterlife is defined as Summerland. And of course, if you are a Gardenian Wiccan, then that ultimately is going to be your source, the Book of Shadows. Now, understand that I'm specifying Gardenian Wicca as opposed to general Wicca or witchcraft because there is a major difference. There are plenty of people who will make their own versions, just like Gerald Gardner did, which we'll get into the problems of in a moment. But ultimately, if someone specifies for you Gardenian Wicca, or they say, I'm a Wiccan, and you ask them, are you Gardenian or just a regular Wiccan? That's going to build a bridge in of itself because it shows that you've at least taken the time to look into the differences or specifics of their beliefs. If you encounter someone who's just a run-of-the-mill Wiccan, you don't have to bring up Gerald Gardner at all. But if someone specifies this, it's important to note that you can, in fact, read the Book of Shadows. Sacred text online is a good place for it. They have a few translations available. It's not as if it wasn't a different language than English, but different iterations and versions of it that are all basically the same thing. And again, without being too graphic, most of it is just manuals for molesting children, but I digress. The claims of Wicca, and again, moving on from the history and foundations of it, is ultimately centered around their belief in ethics, their belief of God, their belief in the afterlife and the purpose of this life, much like anything else in terms of religion. And when we are able to get specific about the differences between us, you're not only going to be able to spot the major difference between, oh, yeah, you believe the same thing that I do, we just call it by different names. No, you can note this if they are, again, properly defined. When the Wiccan is defining right and wrong, we as Christians would say that it's based on the character, the model, the nature of Jesus Christ, God the Son, who came to this world to show us what objective good is, and therefore everything apart from his character, his nature, is not what is good. He is the good, objectively. In Wicca, it's the concept entirely thrown on its head. Instead of principle-based, it's idea-based on a self-determined, experience-based idea. The Wiccan Rede is how they summarize this. They say, do what ye will, but do no harm. And this is where they would make the distinction between black magic, meaning the influences of these narcotics that would cause harm, and white magic, which is what Wiccans would call the positive aspects of their religion, the ones that they're encouraged to exercise when it comes to these sort of virtues, self-deception and illusion that would produce pleasure or provide peace or, in modern terms, in the most simplest of sense, get them high or get them relaxed. But the idea is centered around that, is the use of these narcotics, rituals, and hypnotic states that are intending to alter their perception in a positive sense as opposed to the perception of others in a negative sense. That's where the idea of curses come in. And Wiccans, and for the most part, they can be commended for this, are very much discouraged from even dabbling in black magic. Now, when it comes to their view of God, I mentioned before that they regard it as the goddess, especially if they're followers of Gerald Gardner. But in some sense, it would be more comparable to Gaia in Greek paganism, Mother Earth, if you will. In the most general sense, it's to make sure that you are knowing where the average witch is coming from. So when they regard nature, it's more as a concept than a personification, an actual individual. But whether or not they would say that individually, and this is what's most important when engaging with witches, sometimes they do, in fact, regard Mother Earth or the goddess as an actual person that they could interact with face to face, just like the pagans would in the ancient world, or as we would regard as superheroes in the modern day. But the majority of the time, they would try to come across as rational and note it as a power or influence in the force of nature, and then they just identify it as the goddess because that's what's in authority over all of us: life, death, birth, life. You get the idea. So when you encounter someone who's putting on this attitude and experiencing life, enjoying what life has to offer, and more invested in the conscious existence of this life than that which will take place after this life, that's where ultimately most of the Wiccans, witches, practicers of witchcraft, will ultimately stem their theology from. It's that it's an experience-based interaction with these sort of entities, whether I regard them as a concept or as an individual. That's what you need to ask questions about. Because while the Wiccan may regard a personal goddess that they could interact with or have spoken through visions, usually induced by said drugs, we also can meet them on common ground and say, well, I believe that Jesus of Nazareth has also encountered us in a moment of history, but I don't need any assistance, so to speak, in interacting with him. Now, this is where then we get into the nature of the afterlife, because as I stated before, most would focus more on this life than the next. But the majority of Wiccans, especially Gardenian Wiccans, would believe about the nature of the afterlife is actually a misuse of the word that they would use. And this is something very important to point out. When a Wiccan is asked, well, what do you do when this life is over, when perhaps the use of sorcery catches up with you and you end up overdosing in some way, God forbid, goddess forbid if they would prefer. But they would use the term reincarnation to say, well, it will ultimately just come back and that I will relive this life in a new way. The problem is that the term reincarnation, what would originate from Hindu culture as, isn't a hope, but a punishment. The punishment of reincarnation is actually judging them because of acts of compassion, attachment, or desire, literally dukkha in their words in the Bhagavad Gita. The main evils of Hinduism and Buddhism as well are all stemming from this idea that if you do good or do evil, it's setting the universe out of balance, and that you will be forced to continue to exist until you reach enlightenment in which you don't care about anything. Lord Krishna, in the Bhagavad Gita's advice to his disciple Arunja, was making that point in emphasis. He was debating with himself about whether or not to get involved with a war with his family members, that it would ultimately either result in the deaths of so many of those that he formerly cared about, that if he neglected this, then the society would become corrupt and so forth. And Krishna's, the incarnation of one of the Hindu gods, literally told him, your problem is that you care. Stop it and you'll be happy. And I say happy, again, is a very loose term, but that's the idea that they're taking it from. Whereas in Wicca, it's flipped on its head. Instead of a punishment, it's a reward. It's not a thing to avoid. It's an ongoing reality through which they derive hope. And since the majority of the Wiccan perspective is to feel and enjoy things in this life, their hope is therefore that they'll be able to enjoy another life the same way or the new way that they weren't able to or that they were limited from before. When this comes up, and if you want to do research on Hinduism, by all means, what's really important to point out is that that idea of them entering into a new human body with their consciousness and ability to feel and remember is not reincarnation. The word that would be used in Hindu would be, or Sanskrit, would translate as transmigration. And if you point these things out, it will become important later when it notes that they're just making things up as they go along, or taking the word of people who also were making things up as they went along and didn't know what they actually meant. And if just a simple check in the dictionary, or at least a cultural regard for where those terms came from first, does get them to pay more attention, it could lead to better conversations than just, well, I guess saying, here's what I think as opposed to what actually is. We don't want to deal with hypotheticals when it comes to something as important as reality. Now, when it comes down to it, and I did mention this, regarding the authority of Wiccans, where they're getting their words from, we as Christians would regard the words of Jesus, his apostles, and the prophets before them as authorities because they not only put themselves forward as spokesman, literally that's what a prophet means, for God, and verified this through public miracles and accountability to everything that they said legally as much as conceptually. We also would need to recognize that, like with their handling of reincarnation, their handling of the concept of the goddess, it flips the term once again on its head and noting that it's not based off of, I'm trusting this person for these reasons. The authority of Wiccans is whether or not this experience is positive or negative to me in a sensual sense. And that can apply to a wide number of things, not just drugs, but also rituals involving sex and bloodletting. Now, I'm going to say this as oftentimes as it needs to. Not all Wiccans are Gardenian Wiccans, so they're not going to be practicing the rituals that you read in the Book of Shadows. Most of them, in fact, have written their own books of shadows, if you will, and their rituals based on what has worked for them from personal experience. And if you note that in passing, that's almost how a lot of Christians tend to believe Christianity is to be practiced today, that it's not a matter of whether I can find that scripturally, it's what's worked for me, and then I just tack Jesus' name on it. Same thing is true when it comes to the majority of Wiccans. It would give them the opportunity to avoid accountability or guilt by association with Gerald Gardner's claims, which are verifiably false, and it would establish their reasons for why they believe the supernatural. You can't tell me I'm wrong. I saw this. I felt this. And that would be the majority of the argument. So this is where it ultimately comes down to the things we need to understand before engaging Wiccans. Once again, if you take even at a cursory glance the fact that Gerald Gardner popularized Wicca. I noted him as the founder, but also not. It's not because someone used the term Wicca before him, but because the approach towards the supernatural through the influence of drugs is not something that he invented. This is something that goes back to the Tower of Babel, for all I know. We also need to note that Gardner did not invent the profession of witches or warlocks in a religious context. This is something that we have documentation for going all the way to the time of the 4th century in Rome, but I'm sure even before that. Also note, Gerald Gardner is not the first person in history to use drugs and rituals to determine the nature of the supernatural. There are people who use that today, and of course, in a unique way, contradictory to what Gerald Gardner would conclude. So the question then would be, who do Wiccans follow? And the answer will depend on who you're talking to. Sometimes it'll be Gerald Gardner, the Gardenian Wiccans. There's others that would use their own experiences. Sometimes other pagan religions. I'm an Egyptian Wiccan, I'm a Babylonian Wiccan, so on and so forth. But Norse culture is the most common, so it's worth at least noting that much. All Wiccans, and this is the point, have to be addressed on a person-by-person basis, because what they get from Gerald Gardner aren't always his claims, and every Wiccan is going to call themselves that because they would ultimately agree with his methodology, or not. If you are dealing with a Gardenian Wiccan, then you have their book and you have their founder, and you can challenge them both just like you would Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. But if, on the other hand, they are basing it off of self-experience, this is where you then need to challenge them on a person-by-person basis, ask them their experiences, and then be ready to ask important questions. But this is where it ultimately comes down to it. The challenge between Christianity and witchcraft isn't a battle that's fought with blades and bullets. It's one that holds experience as greater than or equal to revelation from God. Some would note that their experiences are divine revelation, but without a metric to test them, and others still would note that my experiences matter more than if a God were to appear right in front of me, because I'm just here to have a good time. Note that. So this is where we then will conclude the last third of the broadcast with some challenges that need to be made towards Wicca, the sort of issues that I will introduce you to and that can be studied in more detail at a later time. When it comes down to the sort of questions that need to be asked, the first and most important in regard to that previous point, experience or revelation, that tug of war, the question needs to be, can truth about religion be known? The average witch is going to say that no, it can't, and it doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're enjoying it or not. When their opinion is just as valid as anyone else's, anyone's experience is just as valid as anyone else's, the best response to this is going to first ask if truth exists. And of course, if they are going to deny that, that would be a self-defeating statement, which you can point out to them. There is no truth. Is that true? Because the statement, there is no truth, claims to be true. But if it is true that there is no truth, then you get the point. Your brain starts to break down at that point. You can't have and also not have a concept like absolute truth when, of course, it is necessary to exist fundamentally in order for anything to be actually experienced. So if then they can get out of that self-defeating loop, and then you call them back and say, so there is such a thing as false as opposed to true. Would you want to know if something is false as opposed to true, or is it just a matter of being comfortable? And note that you don't necessarily have to be as forceful up front, unless you're chatting online and that's the only interaction you'll get with them, in saying that Wicca is false. You can just emphasize, do you want to know what is true? And if they turn away from you at that point, then it's better not to waste your time with someone who didn't believe that you even existed when you were talking to them. But if, on the other hand, they are able to accept the fact that there is truth and there are at least 2 brain cells left, and we can use our remaining 2 and hopefully come up with something important. So when it comes down to it, this is where we ultimately need to put our money on the table. Set up a standard by which you'd recognize reasons to believe something. Let them do the same, and then compare the facts on the table. Because when it comes down to it, our reasons for trusting Jesus are ultimately demonstrated by his actions in history. they would also demonstrate their own experiences in their personal lives, which could be an even more direct version of history. But when we're talking about comparing data and facts, you can then ask them, are drug-induced hallucinations a better standard for truth than ancient history? And there will be people who will genuinely try to challenge that. I would rather believe what I know today, or at least I think I knew today, than I couldn't possibly have known centuries, if not millennia, before I was ever born. If you let them think about this, then understand the Holy Spirit can work with that. God's word's not going to return void. If you note the fact that there is a reason to believe Christianity, most of them have never heard that before. And if you put that information forward and provide verse citations for it, that will accomplish far more than just, threatening to burn them at the stake, or them generally more often victimizing themselves and saying, you're just trying to burn them at the stake. It's not going to accomplish anything. We want to accomplish something, so let the Holy Spirit do his job. He's much better at it. Another question to ask, and this is only if you encounter someone who specifically says, well, I observed Gerald Gardner's version of Wicca. I'm a Gardinian Wiccan. The question you then would ask is, did Gerald Gardner really get his information about the supernatural from the ancient Druids? Because that's his authority. That's what he cited as his resurrection evidence, if you will. The reality of this is, and you can read this available online, there's many translations from the Latin, written by Julius Caesar, the Gallic Wars. He notes that the majority, if not all, of the Druids were exterminated in his conquest of Gaul, and this took place almost a century before the time of Christ. The only writings that we actually have to verify that the Druids even existed were compiled by a Christian, ironically enough, named Snorri Sturluson. That's Snorri Sturluson. He was an Icelandic gentleman, a proper Norseman like myself. When he wrote these things down, by the way, this was over 1,000 years after the extermination of the Druids at the hands of other pagans, by the way. The Romans weren't Christians yet. So noting this point, nobody was Christians yet. They were before the time of Christ. But when he notes all of their practice and rituals, understand that in reference to today, they died 2,100 years ago. And in reference to any information about their existence, that's 1,000 years before today as well. So when they're Gardinian, that's where you can put historical data forward and say there is no way that he could have possibly known these things. If not, that just putting forward the fact he was lying about this to justify his hobby of, well, I already said it, I won't do it again. But if they aren't willing to accept just basic facts about history, they say, oh, well, that was changed by some Christian council or whatever. You haven't mentioned Christianity once. Snorri Sturluson himself was just trying to preserve some aspect of his culture. And if you want to get even more technical, we don't have anything from Snorri until about 500 years after that. A copy of it was preserved by Brynjolfur Svensson, who was a Christian bishop, who also saw some value in knowing history, even if he didn't agree with the theology. And if you read the prose and poetic Eddas, the sagas of the Danes, the annals and so forth, it's all available online. Same source, by the way, as the Book of Shadows. Sacred Text has a good library available digitally, and it's all free. But the idea of them taking Gardner's word for it, because he got it from the ancient Druids, that can be tested, and that is, in fact, false. And if you want to look these things up, they are available. But when it ultimately comes down to it, once again, their perspective is going to stem from an experienced-based, an idea-based, an individually determined-based view of the supernatural. It's only meaningful to me because it feels right. It feels this way. I have these sort of experiences and so forth. This is where then you need to cut to the jugular, not literally, but going into the fact that they are judging the supernatural on the basis of feelings, that they only consider something relevant on the basis of personal relevance to them, which is then the Christian's open door. This is a question that we ask many times when we encounter Wiccans at our local outreaches. Has someone, this is the question to ask, ever told you that God feels something for you that would even go beyond the way that you feel about him. You can reference Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, that noting when we were enemies of Christ, he loved us. He felt this way towards us. He was willing to invest so much of himself based on these feelings, their terms, of commitment towards you, that he was willing to give his life to ransom you and bring you to his Summerland, not a paradise island, or even necessarily to renew your physical essence over and over again so you can keep having new experiences, but that the greatest possible experience, knowing him, being with him, and properly identifying the fact that heaven is ultimately summarized in 2 words, with Jesus. Do you know how much he loves you? Do you know how much he's done for you to prove that? And if that doesn't inspire some form of feeling that someone would be so invested in you that they would not only endure death, but a prolonged series of spiritual and physical torture along the way in order to demonstrate just how much he's willing to put up with you, then, and that's not the only reason, but I'm just noting the relevance to the Wiccan, then you can hopefully get into more details. Then an open door is established in historical facts. Because if this is ultimately all based on experience, all based on feeling, they are about to have an experience. They are being given the opportunity to understand the Christian perspective isn't to dominate those awful heathens, but it's to simply acknowledge the fact that God showed up and he told us that he cared about us. And when he told us, he didn't just say it, he showed it. The same thing that all Wiccans are looking for through the narcotics, through the drugs, through the rituals, through the experiences that they deem, that they have determined, are going to give them an insight in the supernatural. God did the same thing, but not through sex, not through mutilation, not through ritual, but through his death and resurrection. Now, this is when, hopefully, they will get into something more specific. Would history, then, matter more than feelings? And this is where it ultimately comes down to the dividing line between Christianity and Wicca, because while Wicca does stem from a long history of very divided practices that ultimately only have the laws of chemistry in common with each other, then we can get down to what do we have in our favor instead. If there's something consistent to be said about Christianity, it all stems from the one thing that would make Christianity true or false. You don't have to get involved in what about the Catholics and Protestants, what about this denomination and that. The definition of what it means to be a Christian is not based on how I feel about God, but my recognition of 2 historical facts. Who Jesus of Nazareth was, the Christ aspect of it, and what he did to prove it, why we take him seriously. This conclusion then would be, okay, history. Does this matter more than feelings? It can certainly accompany them, but that's only to motivate getting the data in your head. I can have feelings about God, and it doesn't make me a sinner. I can be very passionate about my relationship with Jesus Christ, but that's not why I'm saved. Any more than if I'm depressed or discouraged, that would also mean that this is the foundation of my belief. When it comes down to it, Jesus rose from the dead whether I feel like it or not. And what you're hoping is that the witch is going to consider that as a more stable, a more firm ground than whatever the rate of decay is from their latest high. So starting with the historical facts of the resurrection, and we've been through these before, but for the remaining 9 minutes, I'd be remiss on a Christian program to not give you information about Jesus. History is going to come from the word histor, which means eyewitness. And as far as historical criticism is concerned, the most strict standard that you need to verify anything is a minimum of 2 separate sources that would have witnessed the same basic details about a thing. Naturally, the details they will emphasize will vary, but a difference in report is not necessarily a contradiction of an idea. If someone said Jesus existed and the same group of Christians, or at least an enemy of Christianity, note that Jesus of Nazareth proactively never existed, that would be something we'd have to examine. If they acknowledge that Jesus existed but form different conclusions about him, like the sources we're going to read, that's what we're actually looking for, that we need to know that Jesus was a real person, because if we're going to ask if Jesus died, is it the way the gospel accounts report? And then, of course, was he seen alive again after his death? What would make that a historical claim is, were there witnesses, and do we have reason to trust them? See again that word, histor. The Christian reports that we have about this are known as the Gospels. That's a collection of 4 biographies written by people who were either directly associated with, like Mark and Luke, or eyewitnesses themselves, like Matthew and John. We also have the writings of their disciples, like Polycarp, Clement, Ignatius, and others, who all reported that Jesus' historical death was through crucifixion. The eyewitnesses of these are, again, numerous. We can mention Matthew, Peter, John, Mary, Mary Magdalene, Salome, Thomas, etc. But according to these reports, and we can note these as individual sources because they're under the category of Christianity, or we could actually be objective with the data and acknowledge that the 4 gospel sources are 4 different sources on the same historical event. We just have the benefit of applying them. Say we want to play their game. Are there any non-Christian sources that would also report alongside the Gospels? Not just different sources, but a different category. That's generally what they try to, the word is equivocate, use the same word but give it a completely different meaning. We can play that game because another form of historical criticism is what's called hostile sources, people who wouldn't believe in this sort of cause but at least acknowledge basic facts about the ideas it's built upon. People who didn't believe in Jesus acknowledged he died. And this is important for Christians to know because if you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus of Nazareth died, it throws the idea that Jesus was a myth out of the window because if you died, that means you were born at some point. And what they report that's most relevant to us about who Jesus was and whether Christianity is true or not are based on how he died. In the Samaritan sources, for example, we have Thallus writing the report that Jerusalem went dark during Jesus' execution. I will pronounce that later, hopefully next time. Execution. And by the way, we don't have Thallus' sources directly, but we do have them confirmed by a Roman source, Julius Africanus, in his book History, Volume 3. We also have Tacitus, who was a Roman. He hated Christians, but in his Annals of the Roman Republic, Book 15, Chapter 44, he reported that Christus, term for Jesus, was executed as a criminal, and he also verifies during the reign of Emperor Tiberius and the prefect Pontius Pilate. According to the Talmud, which is a Jewish source, the Pharisees who ordered his execution reported that he was executed by the Romans. This is Talmud Sanhedrin 67a. He notes him as a sorcerer, interestingly enough, and that he was hung rather than crucified, but we're noting that detail, that they, as enemies, acknowledged Jesus was executed. We also have a more neutral Jewish source from Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3. He reports Jesus was executed during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. And, of course, if all those ancient sources aren't to your fancy, we also have modern atheist scholars that would acknowledge Jesus' historical death is, quoting James D.C. Dunn, one of the 2 facts of the life of Jesus that command universal assent. John Dominic Crossan, also an atheist, said that Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical ever can be. That's with Josephus and Tacitus in mind. And also Bart Ehrman, who's a very popular critic of the Bible in North America, noted, quote, "The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life." So we'd note these things as hostile sources, and with these historical facts, we need to only state 3 things. Jesus existed, Jesus died, and he specifically died by Roman crucifixion. And if you want to know more on that, look up the book William D. Edwards on the Physical Death of Jesus. It's a very short book, but a very graphic medical analysis of what Roman crucifixion actually involved. And that would, of course, put to rest the majority of the issues people have with him rising from the dead and saying, well, he didn't actually die. The Strauss critique, which was written by an atheist as well, said that that fundamentally means that you have no idea what Roman crucifixion was. That's not even an argument, and I'm here to dismiss and debunk Christianity. This is what leads us to the second question, and we'll finish with this. Was Jesus alive again after his death? Do we have witnesses? And, of course, do we have enough to conclude that this is a historical fact? Do we have hostile reports? What facts do we have to work with? Well, we could name them in order. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Salome, and other women who aren't named but noted as beyond these first four. We also have Peter, a man who abandoned him the night he was arrested, according to the eyewitness accounts. Rather embarrassing. James, his physical half-brother. John, Thomas, the surviving apostles together, so not just individual appearances, but group appearances, including, according to a document that's dated within months of the actual event, 500 disciples at one time, which included the apostles. You can read about the resurrection in the gospel accounts in Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, John 20, and Acts chapter 1. However, the most significant passage, and this is one to commit to memory, is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, where it notes that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, and he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. That is the Old Testament. He goes on to list the eyewitnesses. He was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, then by over 500 brethren at once, and then noting parenthetically, some are still alive, you can ask them. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, and then Paul mentions him recalling this tradition, that he was seen by me also. Now, within that, we have enough historical data to conclude Jesus' resurrection, even according to atheist scholars. Bart Ehrman, James D.Z. Dunn, John Dominic Cross, and the people that I mentioned, and more, all date this tradition to within months. It's the earliest piece of historical data we have on anything in history ever. The women, the apostles, the disciples are all noted as Christian reports, but what about hostile? We have Saul of Tarsus, who was an enemy of Christians until he saw Jesus alive after his death, and James ben Joseph, who didn't believe his brother was God until he proved it through his resurrection. This is what it ultimately comes down to. Individuals and groups claim to encounter Jesus after he was crucified, not a hallucination. Friends and foes of Jesus claim to encounter him after he was crucified, not a myth. And lastly, these were witnesses who all endured lives of persecution, torture, and death for sharing this with people, not a lie. Not an experience that's a pleasant one, but certainly something that gives us more to think about than our feelings in regards to religion. These are the things to know when speaking to witches, and I hope that you have productive conversations in the future. Know that prayer will accomplish more than anything else. Better to plead with men about God than God about men. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.